Hello, and welcome to the next edition of Mrs. Mack Knows a Lot About That. Today we're going to be talking Chapter 4, The Organization of Life, Section 2, Evolution. Now, this topic is covered a little bit in biology class, but we're going to cover it a little bit more in detail here than what you would probably cover it in your biology class. If you look at the picture, that is a picture of Charles Darwin. You may have heard of him before. He did a lot of work when it came to evolution and exploring how animals have changed over time. And he's pretty much given credit for determining that this happened, that these animals have changed over time. Because that's essentially what evolution is. Evolution means a change over time. Now, we won't discuss human evolution. We're going to discuss how animals have changed over time. And human evolution, you can believe it or not believe it. So that's kind of why we don't really talk about it in this kind of classroom. But we're going to talk about animal evolution. So some of the differences that you see in animals are hereditary. If you look at one human compared to another human, no two humans look alike. Animals are the same way. Even if they're the same species, there are differences among those animals because there are hereditary differences. They get different traits or genes from their parents. Darwin suggested that the environment was one of the key factors in influencing whether individuals survive, so whether those animals can survive in the wild and go on to produce offspring. And the reason that they're able to go on and produce offspring and survive in the wild is because they have certain traits that allow them to survive and reproduce. Evolution by natural selection. So natural selection basically is a process, and it says that the individuals or the animals or the plants or whatever living organism we're talking about, if they have the best traits that are favorable for that environment, they're going to survive and they're going to reproduce and pass their DNA on to the next generation. Darwin said that over many generations, and we're not talking like 5 or 10 years here, we're talking hundreds of years, natural selection causes the characteristics of the populations to change. Because evolution is a change in the characteristics of that population from one generation to the next. So evolution literally is a change over time. Darwin thought that nature selected certain traits that were more advantageous for the organism's survival. For example, an animal might have sharper claws, and that might help them to catch and kill their prey and survive better if their claws are sharper. So over time, when you have this population that has that beneficial trait more and more, that beneficial trait is what you see more of in the population. So as that population changes, so does the species. So for example, giraffes. Giraffes didn't start out with a long neck. They had short necks, much like that of a horse. But because the food that they were trying to eat was up high in the trees, they were dying because their necks weren't long enough to reach the leaves and stuff that were up in the higher part of the tree. So here comes this giraffe that has an unusually large neck. And the reason he has an unusually large neck is because it was a genetic malfunction. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was a genetic mutation. Okay, so this giraffe that has a long neck, well, longer, it still wasn't as long as a giraffe's neck is now, but it had a longer neck. It was able to mate and produce babies that had that same longer neck. And so eventually, over time, and we're talking thousands of years, the neck of the giraffe got longer and longer and longer because of the DNA. Not because somebody just came and stretched the giraffe's neck and made it longer. That's not how any of those changes occur. The changes occur because of the DNA that gets passed on. So when there's a mutation in an organism, that mutation can get passed on. And if that mutation is beneficial in the environment, then it will be able to be passed on, and the offspring will be able to live as well. So here are some key characteristics of evolution by natural selection. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So if you've ever seen fish that lay eggs, or any animal really, a lot of times they have more babies than will survive. Horseshoe crabs lay hundreds of eggs in the hopes that a few of them will survive and go on to become adults that will then pass on that DNA trait again. Okay, number 2, the environment is hostile and contains limited resources. If organisms and animals are able to just grow and grow and grow and reproduce and have more babies, then what's out there in nature, those resources, they wouldn't be able to support all of those animals. So there has to be a way for them to basically die off and only the stronger ones survive, because if they all survive, there wouldn't be enough food for all of them and they'd all die out anyway. Number 3, organisms differ in the traits they have. Okay, there are many differences in different organisms, different animals, different plants, and those reasons are all due to their inherited DNA. Number 4, some inherited traits provide organisms with an advantage. These traits, like for example, the longer neck of a giraffe, that's an advantageous trait to that animal. That animal's more likely to survive because it's going to reach the leaves that are higher up in the tree, and it's going to pass its DNA on, and that trait is going to continue into the lineage of those animals. Number 5, each generation contains proportionately more organisms with advantageous traits. Well, that should make sense. If you have traits that are helping you to survive, you're more likely to live, and you're more likely to pass on your DNA, and more likely to have offspring, which then pass on the DNA traits as well. So those are the main points of evolution by natural selection. Nature selects a lot of these traits. So an example of evolution is a population of deer that become isolated to a certain area. If that area is cold, then the deer that aren't prepared to survive in a cold climate aren't going to be able to survive and reproduce. The deer that have the genes for the thicker, warmer fur, those are the ones that are going to survive, and they're going to be able to reproduce, and they're going to be able to pass their DNA on, which is the whole objective for animals. Adaptation is the process of becoming adapted to an environment. It's the process that the animal goes through that helps them fit in with that environment, to find food, to find resources that they need to survive. It's an anatomical, physiological, or behavioral change that improves this population's ability to survive. So there's a reason why certain populations are able to survive over others. Coevolution is when two species evolve together. So they both evolve because of long-term interactions with each other, and this is called coevolution. An example is this Hawaiian honeycreeper. If you can see in the picture, it's a little hard to see, but it has a long curved beak, and that's to help it reach the nectar that's at the base of the flower, that's inside of the flower. The flower has structures that help the bird get the pollen on its head. So if the bird has the pollen on its head, when the bird moves to the next flower, it can transfer that pollen and help that plant to reproduce. So this is coevolution. These species have both evolved together to help each other. So they benefit each other. And this is what we call coevolution. So for example, back to the deer that I was explaining, these deer live in warm climate. Some have thicker fur than others. If the deer become separated from the rest of the group, if they go to a cold climate, the deer that have the thicker fur are going to survive. And since they're going to survive, they're going to pass that DNA on to have thicker fur. So as each generation comes about, that population of deer is going to have thicker fur. And after many, many, many generations, most of the deer are going to have thick fur because they're the ones that pass their DNA on to the next generation. So back to the bird, the honey creeper and the plant, there are some certain traits that they have that allow them to co-evolve. For example, the honey creeper has the long curved beak. The plant has two adaptations. It has really sweet nectar, which attracts the bird to it, and it has a structure that forces the pollen onto the bird's head when the bird is getting the nectar from it. Now, we also have something called artificial selection. This is what we humans do specifically when we're breeding dogs. We want certain characteristics of dogs. Sometimes we need dogs to be strong and herders. Sometimes we need dogs that don't shed because kids have allergies. So basically what you do is you take some dogs, you breed them together because they are the same species, even though they're different breeds. They're the same species and they can breed. And so since we do that, we can breed dogs for certain traits. They also do this with fruits, grains, and vegetables. If you've ever seen bicolored corn, that's not natural in nature. But farmers took, sometimes it happens accidentally, but it took a white ear of corn, bred it with a yellow ear of corn, and now you have bicolored corn. What humans do is they're going to save the seeds from the largest, sweetest fruits because those are the traits that you want in fruits and vegetables. You want them to be sweet fruits. You want the vegetables to be, sometimes now they breed them to not have seeds. Okay, but when the farmers select these traits, that's a process that we call artificial selection. It doesn't happen naturally. Humans create it. Evolution of resistance. Okay, so now we have to talk about very quickly evolution of resistance. This is the ability of an organism to tolerate a chemical or disease-causing agent. As the organisms become resistant to the chemical, they're able to continue to pass their DNA on and have other animals and bugs that are resistant to that pesticide. So they're constantly having to put new and different chemicals on the crops to keep the pests away from the crops so the crops don't die. So then you have something called pesticide resistance. Well, they spray pesticides on the crops so that it kills the animals that eat the crops because we don't want our food eaten by animals or insects. So for example, if a pesticide is sprayed on corn to kill grasshoppers, then it's going to kill most of the grasshoppers, but some of the grasshoppers that have a gene that has made them resistant to the pesticide, they're going to be able to reproduce and pass that trait on to their offspring. And over time, you have more grasshoppers that are resistant to the pesticide. And so now you have to get a new pesticide because that one doesn't work anymore. So here's an example. You have insects sprayed with insecticide, a few live, they pass the DNA on. So now you have more resistant. And then when the same insecticide is used again, more insects survive because they're resistant to the pesticide. Okay, so this ends chapter 14, section 1. You will have your summary questions that will be on Schoology. Please let me know if you have any questions. This concludes another episode of Mrs. Mack Knows a Lot About That.